Hello and welcome to another edition of the Iain Dale Book Club. I'm Iain Dale. Well, today we're going to talk about Russia, and particularly Britain's relations with Russia. David Owen, Lord Owen, has written a new book called Riddle, Mystery and Enigma, 200 Years of British-Russian Relations. It's an absolutely fascinating book because it makes you realise how little you actually know about British-Russian relations, going all the way back to the early part of the 19th century. David, welcome. Now, why did you want to write about British-Russian? Because when I saw that you'd written this book, I was thinking, well, that's interesting. Why this in particular?
Well, there are two reasons. The famous Battle of Navarino in Greece is only a few kilometres from my house in Greece, which I've had a house there for 20 years. Gave it to my children. They've just sold it. But I couldn't be without a house in Greece, so I've just bought a much smaller one. So I've kept my sailing boat in the Battle of Navarino, and it's one of the strangest stories of history, really, that this fantastic battle in which the British under Admiral Codrington and French small section and Russian section defeated a massive Ottoman Empire up from Egypt, more or less sank every single ship, and changed the whole future of Greece. I mean, it clinched.
And what year are we talking about now?
1827. It clinched the battles that the Greeks themselves have been fighting very bravely over 4 or 5 years. And after that, it was quite clear that the Ottoman Empire could no longer go on opposing it, and you had 3 very powerful countries supporting Greek independence. And it was celebrated in the streets of London and in Moscow and in Paris. But, a big but, Canning, who'd been the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister just for a short time, and designer of the whole effort, was dead. And Lord Wellington was extremely strong, and he called it the untoward event. And we actually apologized to the Ottoman Empire for defeating them. This puzzled greatly the Russians, who thought it was a great victory, and it puzzled the French too, and has puzzled historians ever since, really. So that was the start, and I thought, well, it's a good way to start, to show that we were close allies fighting a very successful naval battle over just under 200 years ago, and let's move on from there. And then the book goes through the whole question of the ambivalent relations, really, between most of the big European countries and the Ottoman Empire, and nobody more ambivalent than Britain, really, in part because of their attitude to the Battle of Navarino, but in part it was very difficult to know what Russia was up to. And so you started to go into what was called the Great Game, and the British believed that Russia was after India. And so we fought our battles in Afghanistan and were defeated at the height of our imperial power. My own personal belief is that the Great Game is greatly exaggerated. Russia had many other problems on its hand, and I think the last thing it was just going to do, because it's very difficult to get to India without going through Afghanistan. And the Afghans had showed themselves, as they've showed themselves only a few months ago, to be fearsome fighters who don't like any armies from any countries on their territory. But then you came to the Crimean War, basically a French war against Russia, famous, of course, for the charge of the Light Brigade in British history. I don't really think we ought to have been fighting that war. And then
why did we fight that war? Because I mean, we all know, we've all heard of it. We all know about Florence Nightingale, but I think that's about the sum of most people's knowledge.
Well, I think it is, and I think it's a big question mark why we ever did. And I think many people have never really understood why we did. As I say, it was a French battle. The big armies were French. One way would have been to have purely had a naval presence in the Black Sea and stood off the actual fighting. And I think we'd had more influence on the outcome and the settlement. But we then had this very strange period, really, of Gladstone's morality in politics focused on the outrages that the Ottomans were responsible for, being dealt with by Disraeli and others with a certain cynicism. At the height of his power, of course, Gladstone was a huge moral force, and he was really the only statesman of that century which challenged the Ottomans and basically said we had no business in being in cahoots with them, which would have made it easier to have better relations between Britain and Russia had his voice been the strongest voice. But it was controversial even within his own party. But it nevertheless was, I think, the first example of a deep-seated morality guiding British foreign policy, which came back in the next century under human rights.
So how did relations change between Gladstone's time and the beginning of the First World War?
Well, Russia was on side and was an ally under the Tsars from 1914, really, until they started getting defeated in 1916. And Winston Churchill even talked about the Gallipoli strategy with the Russians and promised them that if we took Constantinople, they would have it. It would not be any longer an Ottoman city. And of course, there are a lot of Orthodox Church religious centers in Istanbul or Constantinople, however you like to call it. And of course, that was always been fought over. Then when Russia started to get military defeated abroad and at home, and you saw the rise of Lenin, Britain got dragged into a war, or arguably, if you were a Churchill supporter, were taken into that war by Churchill on the side of the whites. These were the people who were fighting Lenin and fighting red communism. And it was a perfectly legitimate war, and Churchill was right in warning the world of the future dangers of communism. But there was really no spirit for it. You know, the 1418 war had been a ghastly war, massive casualties. We'd won, I think, basically because of Lloyd George, who I think was a brilliant prime minister from 1916 to 1918, introducing convoys, persuading the Americans to come, and having ideas and fighting some, in my view, very bad British generals. But then the question came, will the whites win? The whites were very badly led, divided. They didn't have an understanding of why Lenin was making such inroads with working people in Russia, and that some of the appalling things that happened under various Tsars were starting to sort of roll back. Lloyd George supported Churchill really as far as it was possible, but eventually he sort of wrote him a letter and said, you know, more or less, grow up. I mean, you can't fight every battle, and we have to recognize that the Russians either win this themselves or amongst themselves. We can help them, particularly with ammunition and other things. But if they can't win the war, there's nothing we can do, and we're not going to go and stay fighting wars forever. And I think that was very sage advice. Churchill didn't like it. But it's the first time, really, Churchill bursts onto this war scene. He'd burst onto the scene as a politician, as a liberal, and, First Lord of the Admiralty, but even before that, Home Secretary. And it's an interesting aspect of Churchill's life, not widely known. And then you move really into the situation of how you deal with communism Lenin had chosen a small state, done a deal with the Germans, didn't want to sacrifice his ideology by spreading it across a large country which he didn't think he could contain. And then, of course, Russian power started to develop, but it took time.
What about the relationship between Lenin's government and Britain in the immediate aftermath of the revolution?
Well, the coalition broke up, really, by then, and the Tories were in power, and they didn't want to recognize China. Then you had a Labour government, minority Labour government coming in, and they did recognize Russia. Then there was a sort of divorce again, and then Russia was again recognized by Labour governments. But we didn't really see a lot of Russia during that 20s and 30s.
There was a real fear among, particularly I think, the British establishment that we could go the same way. And presumably that meant that they didn't really want to recognise Russia because they were so fearful of that.
I think there was that tension. And, the then Conservative Party was pretty staid. Mind you, Churchill had joined them by then and began to serve under them. And arguably, at that time, we rather ignored Russia through the 30s. It really only became a big question again, I think, with the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement in 1939, just on the eve of war. So here, there had been this rather interesting period in 1938 when there was an attempt of Russia to come together with Britain and France and with Poland. And Churchill supported it. And a number of conservatives did. It was knocked on the head, basically, by Chamberlain and, to some extent, Halifax. It was an opportunity. I mean, I think it was serious, and I think if they'd taken it just that little bit further, it is possible it might have averted the Second World War. The crucial doubt, really, was Polish-Russian relations, and they were never good, and questionable, really, how much Poland wanted to be involved in this. But we'd seen what happened to Czechoslovakia. Anyhow, it didn't happen. And then you had, Britain's own war, really. I mean, basically, we were on our own for a long period. And then suddenly Churchill, he had a rule that he wouldn't be woken up in the 40s, early 40s, unless Britain was invaded. And so he wasn't told that Russia had been attacked by Germany, although he'd warned Stalin that this was going to happen. Stalin had quite a few warnings. And I think you then see one of the most remarkable days of Churchill's remarkable life. He got out of bed, had his breakfast, cleared his desk, and wrote a speech aimed at the Russian people. It's an extraordinary speech. Eden and Salisbury saw him for lunch with Stafford Cripps, and they were cautioning him on being full-hearted. And he brushed it aside, and they tried again that evening over supper, but it was too late.
What were their reservations?
They thought, how could we be embracing a communist country and that this wouldn't go down very well with the Tory party and with people in the country? And after all, who had been more categorically against Marxism and Soviet communism? Churchill dealt with this absolutely brilliantly. He said, I don't gainsay a single thing I've said about Soviet communism or Marshal Stalin. But, he said, we are now allies against a far more evil force.
So my enemy's enemy is my friend, is it?
Exactly. Yeah. But it was bold and brilliant. And he cut in at various times in his speeches talking about the poor people of Russia were striving, they didn't have food, they were dealing with this. And he was appealing to them to try to build a coalition of the heart, if you like. I mean, I was 4 in 1942, and I was brought up by my mother. My father was away fighting. If I'd left any food on my plate, she'd say, "Think of the poor, starving people of Russia." And we were full of these stories.
Because with me, it was Ethiopia.
Well, we all have our emotional issues, but it was a very remarkable.
And what impact did that have on Stalin? Because he will have known Churchill's views on communism. I mean, did that sort of stop him in his tracks a bit? And did it help lead to the, I'm not sure I would describe it as a friendship between the two, but the burgeoning relationship that they built?
Well, he was only interested in one thing, and that is, when are you going to open up a second front and attack the Germans so as to divert some of these massive German forces which were hitting him back. After all, German tanks got into the outskirts of Moscow.
Yeah.
I remember going in as a very young foreign secretary in the car with Gromyko, the grandfather of foreign ministers, and as we were driving in, nobody knew. We hadn't had any relations with them for 6 years. And he pointed to this cross of steel, armament, as being tank traps, and said, "That is as close as the Germans came to the heart of Moscow. And when you think I'm not moving enough on mutual and balanced force reductions, I admit to you, I'm conservative, I'm nervous, I'm very careful. I've lived through this myself, and most of us Russians, older Russians, have." It was said in a lovely, charming way, actually, to a young foreign secretary, and I was rather impressed by it, and it stayed with me throughout my life.
Well, I can't wait to talk to you about your own personal relations with Russian leaders. We'll come on to that in a bit. But the relationship that Churchill and Stalin had during the war, and then, of course, Roosevelt as well, that... I mean, how did that come about, and how crucial was it to the Allied victory in the end?
I think that Stalin knew absolutely that the crucial power to get in this fight was Russia. It was America. And Roosevelt sent very soon, they were still out of the war, person to see Stalin, and Stalin sent a message back, and he said, "Any American soldiers will be welcome and in the fight. It's inevitable you're going to get in. You should come in fast, come in soon, and what's more, you Russian soldiers will serve under American commanders." Very important and tough, and
it's quite a big thing for Stalin to do.
Yes, he never had to do it in real life, but it was a sign. And then this was taken by his emissary to the Atlantic Charter meeting when Churchill and Roosevelt met. And I think it deeply impressed both Roosevelt and Churchill when he was told about the depth of Stalin's concern. But that went on and on, always on, mainly on to Britain. But well, and I mean, Churchill made tremendous sacrifices to send the Arctic convoys. Now, I don't know whether it was a style of Stalin. He was never grateful for anything. There's one moment in Stalin's career, in the letters that we all have published between Stalin and Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill. And it comes after D-Day. And it's incredibly generous. This is the man who's been arguing and arguing for this second front. And now he openly admits that crossing that Channel Sea and fighting in the way we did was a fantastic feat of arms with great risks. And he salutes the effort in an almost poetic letter. It's a very moving letter. You don't see much of Stalin humanity, if he had it. But that's the one letter that's crucial. But I think that we often forget Roosevelt was still out of the war. He used the Atlantic Charter meeting, an extraordinary thing, these two ships off Canada and Newfoundland. The Charter was written really largely by the British, and Churchill had added his flourishes and everything like that. Stalin moved a few commas and a few words, and really he transformed it, because what he committed, the winners of the war, was to the independence of the British colonies, in particular of India. And there was nothing that Churchill could do about it. He couldn't change this agreement, but Roosevelt was never going to allow the Americans to be the firm, solid allies that we were of the British, and without getting it clear at the end of the war, America was not going to be used to maintain the British Empire. Mm. So there's some very interesting aspects in the relationships between these men. But when, of course, the Japanese attacked at Pearl Harbor, the end of 1941, the situation started to change. Churchill, of course, went over there. But from then on, really, certainly by 1943, Russia saw the big power, the power to work with, was America, and looked on Britain as a secondary element. It was painful for Churchill, but he understood it, funnily enough. When they all met in Tehran, the first time they met, 1943, Churchill said to Lady Violet Bonham-Carter, who he actually nearly got married to, when he came back, that he realized what a small country Britain was. And I think that he realized he couldn't be in the lead any longer. The war was going to be, from our side, settled by Roosevelt. And, of course, the country that paid by far the biggest casualty were Russia. Mm-hmm. And we will not face this in our way we teach history in this country. There's far too much on our sacrifices, which were really small in comparison to the millions of Russians who fought and held the Germans off by a superhuman effort, really, and ensured, really, that Churchill's prediction that, he said to the British people, they're going to stop the Germans coming at us. This is why it's our war. But I'm more really enchanted by the generosity of spirit of Churchill, and the Royal Navy and American Navy and others came in going out in those nights with no light at all, with not as I said, no light, with all light, really, no winter light, and with the German aircraft on the Norwegian aerodromes, literally bombing them as they went in to Murmansk. Mm. And a lot of that food, ammunition and arms went from Murmansk to Leningrad and helped Russia hold Leningrad. The siege of Leningrad went on throughout year after year. And I think that, I did business in Russia for nearly 20 years. And that's another reason why I write about Russia. In the years of Yeltsin and the years of optimism. And I would sometimes have to make a speech, and I would talk about the Arctic convoys, and the older people realized. I don't think, though, that it made the impact, the generosity and the extraordinary raiding of our own resources, that Churchill did, made a big impact on Stalin. I don't think sentiment was not something that was in Stalin's makeup.
Let's move on to after the war and the creation of the so-called Iron Curtain. Churchill, when he'd left office as Prime Minister, made the speech in Fulton, Missouri. And Stalin died in 1953, succeeded in the end by Khrushchev. What were relations like between the Attlee government and Russia, for example?
Not particularly good. Ernest Bevin was foreign minister, in many respects the architect of NATO. And it couldn't have happened unless Truman wanted it. Two great men, really, Truman and Bevin. Truman said in 1945, as an accidental president, really, after Roosevelt's death, "I'm bringing the boys back home." The best thing any politician dreams of doing. And then in 1946, less than a year later, he had to go back to the people and say in America, "I'm afraid I can't keep that promise. The behavior of the Soviet Union is so terrible. We must stay in Europe." I sometimes wish more people in this country realized, and particularly at the moment in France, realized that having American troops on the ground in Europe from 1945 to the present day has prevented war with Russia. It isn't enough to have pledges that they'll come. We saw that problem in 1914 to 1918 and in the early years of the 1939 to 45. They have to be there to stop war. And Bevin's great skill was to realize that NATO could only work, after all the League of Nations failed, if you dealt with the problem of the Senate. The Senate were not prepared to send American troops into battle unless they felt they were under their democratic control structures. And by creating the role of SACEUR and defining SACEUR's role, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, in the treaty, and the Foreign Office came to Bevin with words that were ambivalent. He said, "I want clarity. I want to know what the Americans can do and are expected to do, and what are the command and control disciplines within NATO." It's been the best military alliance that's ever been formed in world history. And there are people now in Europe who seem quite happy to see it go. I'm not.
So moving on into the 50s and 60s, obviously the Soviet Union becomes a nuclear state. Britain has nuclear weapons as well. What were the relations between various prime ministers going through the 50s and 60s like with their Russian counterparts?
Well, we had BNK, Bulgarin and Khrushchev, coming around looking at our shops at one stage. We didn't have a lot of contact, to be blunt, but NATO was not just a military alliance, it was also an ideological alliance, and we were always taking on communism. I think the lowest point really was, well, certainly in my life, as a young medical student at Cambridge in 1956, when Russia invaded Hungary, and you heard this broadcast and saying, "Come and help us, come and help us." And there was a click, and the line was cut, and they were on their own. And some even left university, didn't.
And this was right in the middle of the Suez Crisis as well.
It was right, well, it was almost coinciding with the Americans telling Eden that he had to withdraw his forces. And why? Because it was such an outrageous breach of trust. I mean, Eden was effectively removed from office. I mean, it's said it was because of his health. Maybe his conduct was influenced by his health. I've written about that elsewhere. But the basic facts of life was he lied to the House of Commons, and you can't get away with that. He said there was no collusion between our British forces and the French forces and the Israelis. And we all now know they were up to their neck in this extraordinary plan that the Israelis would attack, and then the British and French would say, well, we'll come in and sort this out and go down between the Israeli and Egyptian forces. And it was never told to the Americans. Eisenhower was fighting an election. You know, even the most confident of politicians get worried about elections. Mrs. Thatcher used to pack her bags before the election. And here was Eisenhower presented with this attack and been lied to by his allies And the soldier in him took over, and he just told us to get stuffed, effectively, and told us that if they didn't stop our forces halfway down the canal. Churchill's famous remark was, "I'm not sure I'd have been brave enough to put them in, but I wouldn't have been weak enough, effectively, not to stop them." But, I mean, we had to be stopped. Our pound was under great pressure, and the Americans were determined to force a retreat of our forces, effectively. It was a huge humiliation, from which the French realized that you had to be on your own and you couldn't trust the Americans. And the British thought you better learn how to treat the Americans properly.
And that really has guided US-UK relations ever since, in a way, hasn't it? I mean, there have been the odd spat here and there.
Yeah, but basically we're friends. And again, that now seems to be up for grabs in our society. I mean, I have my very serious criticisms of Prime Minister Blair and the way he conducted the war against Iraq. But up until a few months ago, one of the guiding principles of him, as it was indeed of Harold Wilson, who didn't approve of the Vietnam War, but thought the price of saying he did and supporting in words would enabled him not to have to send British troops, which he didn't do. But Blair always was never ready to risk damaging the American-British relationship, and for good and honest reasons. Yet he, in the midst of the Afghan withdrawal of US troops, attacked Biden in extraordinary terms. And, you know, all this talk about this big Afghan withdrawal, I mean, the Americans were offered a deal that their troops would not be fired on in the period of withdrawal. The most dangerous period of all troops in all wars is withdrawal. And it was done badly and clumsily in a lot of ways. But, I mean, overall, America's it's just joined Russia now, as well as we talked about earlier, Britain. You don't beat the Afghans if you go in and fight. I don't know why this is a proper place to tell this story, but
feel free.
When I was a medical student, I went to Afghanistan when I was 21. I was on an archaeological expedition, and we were on horseback, about 14,000 feet, and we'd been riding for about 4 hours. So I jumped off the saddle to have a pee on the nearest boulder, and it was just about to happen when the boulder moved. And there was an Afghan with a grey blanket over his shoulder like this. Anyway, I thought to myself then, you can't beat these guys. If they can literally shadow you for hours when you're on horses, and they've got their gun with them, and you just can't beat them. And we better start realizing. I hope nobody else in the next 50 years decides to have a go at putting troops into Afghanistan.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but we expelled a lot of Soviet spies under Ted Heath, didn't we?
No.
Have I imagined that?
Well, yes, you're right. It was Alec Hume as the Foreign Secretary. Yeah. Yes. I mean, it got rid of 119, and that was why I went after 6.5 years as Foreign Secretary, because our relations were so bad. But we now have had disclosed to us why it was such a savage action, and I think it was the correct action. The word sabotage was identified as being what these Russian so-called diplomats were being encouraged to do. Sabotage in the country in which you're meant to be holding a diplomatic position. And I think that Ted Heath and Alec Hume were completely correct to put that flag up. And of course now you come to the equivalent, really, of what happened in Salisbury. And therefore relations with Russia are dreadful at the moment, Very, very bad. It's one of the reasons I wrote this book.
Let's go on to the present day a little bit later. But, I mean, you said when you became Foreign Secretary in 1977, there had been essentially no relations for about 6 years. So you obviously made the decision that needed to change. Why was that?
We were dealing with Africa, and we had to have a force to go in and get and supervise free elections in Rhodesia, as it then was, in Zimbabwe. I wanted a Commonwealth force, but I couldn't persuade the cabinet to do that. The other one was a soft option, really, which a UN force. Well, a UN force wouldn't even get it. It could be vetoed. So I had to go and persuade the Russians why we needed a UN operation in Africa. So I was driven by a major policy operation, which was under the Anglo-American Russian initiative, which was really Jim Callaghan and my policy, and basically what was then later introduced by Lord Caradon and Margaret Thatcher, on which Rhodesia went to independence. But at that stage, that was the reason. And as I went down the steps, I had no idea what welcome, and it really surprised me to find Gromyko at the bottom of the steps. And I really told you the earlier message.
Because even then, he'd been around for donkey's years.
He'd been here for donkey's years. He was tough as old boots, though. I remember he fainted addressing the UN Assembly. And I saw him 20 minutes after he'd finished his speech. He went back in and did his speech, and I spoke to him. And he knew I was a doctor, but he brushed it all off.
But for somebody, I mean, you had been appointed Foreign Secretary. How old were you? 38. 38. Yeah. Just from a psychological point of view, when you're walking down those steps to meet Gromyko, I mean, that must have been quite a moment for you.
He'd have been slightly younger than me when he was appointed.
No, you know what I mean.
I know exactly what you mean, but I felt that the mission I was on was a proper one, and I could succeed. We concocted a sort of...
Did they know why you were there?
Yes, right. Yes. But we arranged a treaty rather hurriedly. It was not a nuclear treaty. It sounds better than it was. You know, it was tidying up nuclear arrangements which had really fallen naturally following American and Russian diplomacy, and so Britain put its house in order, so to speak, on security and things like that. So that was signed, and one of the things I was being asked to do was to look very hard at the Russian president's jaw and see whether he had cancer. And he was aging, Brezhnev, and there was some difficulty in him speaking, and MI6 wanted me to discuss that. He spoke very friendly, but he let Gromyko do most of the talking. He was aging fast at that stage. Gromyko's biggest issue was the Helsinki Final Act, which had gone through in 1977, and he had sold it to the Politburo as meaning that the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, would now be accepted by all of us within the West as part of the Soviet Union. That was not our interpretation of the treaty, and he really went hard at me on this issue. And even when in a social gathering, when I was relying on his interpreter, he hit me hard on this issue. Fortunately, I was well briefed and hit hard back, but he was no softy.
No, I think he certainly had a reputation for being completely humourless, but I'm not sure. Often humourless people in public are quite funny behind the scenes.
He was a charming host in this. He asked me whether I wanted to go to the ballet in a way that made me realise he'd been to so many ballets. He was praying, I'd say, we'd have a sort of folk song evening and that sort of thing. And I chose that. And that put him in a good mood. And he was in a very good mood throughout the whole thing, singing away with the songs and tapping it out and things like that. I had respect for him. Yeah.
So for the rest of the time that you were Foreign Secretary, for 2 years, what encounters did you have with the Soviets during that period, 77 to 79, apart from what you've just told us?
Nothing very bad, of course. They went into Afghanistan, but we'd lost the election by then. But I knew the whole psychological issue. I mean, Brzezinski got very upset about it at one stage.
He was Carter's national security advisor.
And Carter wanted to put sanctions on and everything like that. And I took the view that they'll go the way of the British. They'll go the way of us. We shouldn't get too worried about it. And then in opposition, when I was pretty soon in the SDP, I knew Pakistan pretty well, and I was seeing the Mujahideen, and I was totally in favour of us putting in handheld missiles and to force the Russians out. And there's no doubt that the supplies of arms from America and Britain helped, and I took a tough line on that. And one of their missiles on the ground went into the black market. Our missiles went to the black market and was fired in a plane in Yugoslavia when I was an envoy. Fortunately, I wasn't on the plane, though. We were actually due to go on the plane. So my sins could have come back to me.
Well, indeed. 1980 is absolutely fascinating time. Obviously, Reagan comes to power in America. Brezhnev is still there, then is succeeded by Andropov and very quickly Chernyenko. I've got that order right, haven't I? Chernyenko.
Yes.
And then Gorbachev arrives in 1986, I think it was. And Margaret Thatcher, as Prime Minister, obviously had a very close relationship with Reagan, one or two bumps in the road that people seem to forget nowadays, but that, generally they had a very close relationship. How crucial was she, how crucial was Britain in playing the sort of intermediary between Gromyko and Reagan in those early years?
I think...
So Gorbachev, not Gromyko. I think I said Gromyko,
I think
didn't I?
that we had a very good spy at that stage. It had come in when I was Foreign Secretary. And his intelligence was telling Margaret Thatcher at one stage that the Russians were getting very anxious about NATO maneuvers and were Reagan language. And the thing was getting out of control. Andropov himself spoke bitterly the short time he was head of the country about this. And she gave that intelligence direct to Reagan, was very closely held in Britain. And that definitely influenced him. And I think from then on, he realized this is really dangerous. I think Reagan is a totally underrated figure. And he had great skills of man management. And I think he made those initial talks in Geneva a success with Gorbachev. But I think that Margaret Thatcher was helpful. But then she actually did her best to destroy Reykjavik. Reykjavik was a very important meeting where for the first time getting rid of the nuclear weapons was on it. She used to have this phrase, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Well, on that basis, you'll never get some serious disarmament. It's difficult, but I think Reagan was important. But I would urge you to look at the whole struggle with the Soviet Union from Stalin right through to Yeltsin as one in which many people contributed from different countries. Willy Brandt, a huge figure in German politics and starting a détente, Henry Kissinger, Nixon himself. There are many, and Bevin we've already mentioned. I think the struggle against communism has many people who are heroes and heroines, and we should not get ourselves fixed on the belief that there was something very special about Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. It was fortuitous timing in some senses, but they certainly helped, and we shouldn't, in the list of people, they certainly deserve a place.
1990s, eventually Gorbachev goes, Yeltsin takes over. John Major and Yeltsin got on quite well, I believe.
Yes, and one of the reasons is when Yeltsin went on the tank, he was still very vulnerable. For 3 days, It looked as if he could be overthrown. And John Major, to his credit, didn't hedge his bets. And he went in flat in with verbal assurances to Yeltsin and treating him as if he was still in control of the country full-heartedly. And Yeltsin never forgot it. I actually heard him say that. And whereas Mitterrand, canny, many ways more astute, wiser in some ways than Major, but nevertheless, he hedged his bets. And when you're that exposed, as Yeltsin was, you remember the ones who stay with you in difficult times.
And then, of course, we come on to the Putin era, which he's been effectively running Russia now for more than 20 years. Initially, Tony Blair and Putin, I think, seemed to get on quite well. Putin got on quite well with George W. Bush, particularly.
Yes, I was in the same room when Blair was Prime Minister. I was, in fact, at that time, chairman of Yukos International, this large Russian oil company whose boss, Khodorkovsky, was put in jail. So at that stage, I was there not because of my political thing, but my business career. And they both made great speeches about BP's linkage and had stayed at Buckingham Palace. In fact, at Buckingham Palace, you know, when sometimes you're in a room and somebody is moving across the room and you feel they're coming for you. In this case, a very large person was clearly heading for me, and he stood in front of my wife and myself, and he poked his finger on my chest, Russian. You tell Khodorkovsky to stay out of politics. Khodorkovsky was the boss of Yukos. I made sure that message got back to Khodorkovsky very quickly. And it was the last warning he had before they arrested him, put him in prison. He spent some 13 years in jail and eventually came out, now living quiet life. No, I mean, there was great hopes of Putin. We still don't know where Putin is going. The key to Putin is Andropov, 17 years head of the KGB. Head of the KGB when Putin was a KGB person in East Germany. When Putin became president first, when Yeltsin made him a temporary president, and then he had to fight the election, was he put flowers on the grave of Andropov's funeral. Then when he became full president, he put a plaque on Andropov's flat in Moscow. And then later, he saw that a statue of Andropov was built in St. Petersburg, his hometown. That's the key to... Andropov was straight, not corrupt. But Andropov was a very firm communist, but he put a lot of Russian money out of Russia at one crucial stage. And he taught KGB people to operate by stealing industrial secrets and other things and investing money in Russia. And Putin took all those skills into his thing. But with Putin, the back of my book, there's a picture of Putin standing with a candle in the cathedral, which Stalin razed to the ground and which Yeltsin totally rebuilt.
I don't know if we can see that.
And it poses a question. This man is not a communist. He may be many things, but he's not a communist. He's probably not even a dictator. Some dictators have paid attention to trying to get elected properly. He undoubtedly, in the first two elections, got elected properly. And still, you can argue he struggles, but would win. But of course, he plugs the figures. But where's he going? Is he wanting to be another Tsar? What does he do?
On the surface, it looks like that, doesn't it?
I think it's possible, and I think that's why we should be engaging with Russia. And I end this book in saying Boris Johnson and Putin must have a dialogue. That means not just one meeting, 2 meetings. It means a steady, persistent dialogue, the sort that Kissinger has established with Putin all the time he's been president. And in that way, you can alleviate some of the worst things happening and try and prevent and try and make some good things happen. And I say in the book, it's not anything less than a duty for those 2 men to talk to each other. And I'm very pleased that Biden has done so. Obama didn't handle Putin well. When he said that Russia was just a regional country, that was the deepest insult you can give to the Russians. They see themselves as a great nation. And if you go to the Middle East and you ask yourself, how can we get this issue settled? And we should be able to. Russia is going to be there as of right, and because of Putin. Putin, one of the first Russian leaders to always see Israeli leaders. Why? There's a vast Russian population in Israel, but it's not just that. He is ready to talk to all sides, Putin. And you can engage with him.
But he makes it very difficult, doesn't he?
He makes it almost impossible.
I mean, you look at the murder of Litvinenko back in 2006, I think it was.
Yeah.
And really the bad relations, I think, probably you can date back to that.
Yes, polonium.
And then you have the Skripals, and you think, well, how can we have proper relations with a leader
I don't think
like
it was
that?
possible for Theresa May to have good, even dialogue with him. I don't criticise. And I think she handled actually both, certainly Salisbury, very well indeed. But there comes a time when that has to be not forgotten. Maybe there's still things we could be doing, particularly about the woman, the innocent civilian who was killed because he picked up a perfume bottle that had this foul poison in it. So we have to tell him that this is not acceptable. Also, this constant American intervention now in industrial life and in political life and in trying to turn elections in America. Now, he would say, if he was here, I'm sure, well, it was started by Hillary Clinton when she went against me in the 2012 election and made it much harder for me to win. And I think it's probably true. But come on, grow up. This interventionism that Russia is doing in every walk of life is basically explosive, and he needs to understand it. And he needs to understand that now's the time to try and place this lower in their list of priorities and eventually get rid of it. We have to respond, though, and we have to make a dialogue worthwhile.
We're recording this in the first week of November 2021, and this week Boris Johnson and Vladimir Putin have had a phone conversation. We got a readout from that. I'm never sure how these readouts are, how accurate they are. Do you take encouragement from that?
Yes, I think it's a good issue on which to talk to him direct, the climate. I think he takes it probably quite seriously. I don't know that. But, I mean, Russian science is good, and it has been good for decades, centuries, you could say. And I think that in my book, I look at Russia from at the top of the North Pole, and you look down on the Arctic, and you see a different view of Russia, this massive marine boundary line that they have on the top of our world, in which they've already got 7 military bases, on which they are now putting tankers of oil and goods going on the much quicker routes to Japan or China. So we have to realize their geographic importance, we have to realize their historic importance, and on the climate control, they can be helpful. They've got good science. Science and technology is what will crack the cultural, the real problems of the global warming. It's not going to be easy, but I'm actually surprisingly optimistic about that. I know it's not fashionable to be so, but we've ignored the science. The science has been telling us this for years, decades, and now we're starting to take it seriously.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I feel we've probably only scratched the surface in an hour-long conversation, but that's why people should buy the book, because it is a fascinating history of British-Russian relations. And I only got the book yesterday, so I've only skim-read it, but I look forward to reading it properly over the coming weeks. David Owen, thank you very much indeed. The book is called Riddle, Mystery and Enigma, 200 Years of British-Russian Relations. It's by David Owen, published by House Publishing at the rather cheap price, I think, of £20. Join us again next week. Goodbye.